They say poker is a game of cards. But out on the road, it was always a game of men. I was 19 years old the first time I realized poker had nothing to do with cards. It was about men. Men who lied with smiles. Men who shook hands with one hand and hid knives with the other. That night, in a bar outside Amarillo, Texas, I lost my first real hand. And I paid for it with blood. Back then, I thought I understood poker. I had grown up watching games at kitchen tables and VFW halls, listening to old men argue over nickels and dimes, believing the cards told the whole story. I believed luck mattered. I believed skill was enough. Most of all, I believed that if you played fair, the game would respect you in return. I was wrong. The bar sat alone off a cracked stretch of highway, the kind of place you wouldn't notice unless your car was already running low on gas or hope. The sign outside flickered like it was struggling to stay awake, and the windows were stained with years of smoke and dust. Inside, the air smelled of cheap whiskey, sweat, and something older, regret, maybe, or fear. I didn't know it then, but every man in that room was there for a reason. Some were running from something, some were waiting for something, and a few were hunting. I was just passing through. I sat quietly at the end of the bar for almost 2 hours, nursing the same drink, watching the backroom door open and close. Each time it opened, laughter spilled out, loud, forced, dangerous laughter, the kind that sounded friendly until you listened closely enough to hear the tension underneath. When I finally walked into that room, no one looked surprised. That should have been my first warning. There were 5 men at the table. No introductions, no small talk, just nods. The felt was worn thin, the cards slightly bent at the corners. Someone had scratched initials into the wooden table, probably to mark a win they wanted to remember or a loss they couldn't forget. I bought in with money I couldn't afford to lose. At first, everything felt calm. Too calm. I folded more than I played, watching the rhythm of the game instead of chasing it. One man tapped his fingers when he was weak. Another leaned back when he was strong. A third never changed his posture at all, no matter what he held. I told myself I was learning. I told myself I was in control. That's what arrogance feels like when it's quiet. The hand that ended me came late. The room had grown heavier by then, smoke hanging low under the single bulb, sweat darkening collars and sleeves. I looked down and saw 2 aces staring back at me. Pocket rockets. The best hand you can be dealt. My heart didn't race. It slowed. I felt calm, confident, invincible. I raised. One man folded, then another. The man across from me stayed in. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He just looked at me like he already knew how the story ended. The cards came down one by one. Each one felt like a step towards something. I couldn't stop anymore. By the river, I was all in. When the final card hit the table, no one spoke. The silence was louder than any shout. He turned over his hand slowly, almost respectfully. Not better cards, better timing, better understanding, better instincts. He hadn't played the hand. He had played me. I stared at the table, waiting for something to change. For someone to laugh and say it was a joke. For the cards to rearrange themselves into a different truth. They didn't. I stood up, my hands shaking, despite my effort to stay calm. That's when I felt it, a sharp, sudden pain across my knuckles. Someone had slammed a bottle down where my hand still rested. "Don't touch what's not yours," a voice said quietly. Blood dripped onto the felt. No one moved to help me. No one looked surprised. I left that bar with my pride gone, my money gone, and my hand wrapped in a dirty towel. I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the steering wheel, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. I could have driven away. I could have gone home. I could have decided that poker wasn't worth the risk. Instead, I stayed. Because something else had happened in that room. Something I didn't understand yet, but felt deep in my bones. I had seen the truth. Poker wasn't about the cards you were dealt. It was about the men who dealt them. It was about who was watching, who was waiting, and who was willing to take something from you when you weren't looking. It was about knowing when to push, when to fold, and when to walk away before the game followed you out into the parking lot. That night didn't make me quit. It made me dangerous. And as I drove out of Amarillo before sunrise, my hands still throbbing, I promised myself one thing. I would never lose the same way twice. What I didn't know then was that every road I took after that night would lead me deeper into the game, into bigger wins, darker losses, and choices I still don't know how to justify. But it all started there. With 2 aces. And a lesson written in blood. In the early 1960s, America was loud on television, but quiet on the roads. Every night, living rooms glowed with polished smiles and perfect families. Presidents spoke with confidence. Commercials promised happiness in a bottle, a car, or a pack of cigarettes. On the screen, everything looked clean, orderly, certain. Out on the highway, it was a different country. The roads didn't care about speeches or slogans. They stretched on endlessly, cracked and sunburned, cutting through fields, deserts, and towns that looked like they'd already been forgotten. Gas stations buzzed with dying neon. Motels smelled like bleach and loneliness. And every mile carried the same question. How far are you willing to go before you turn back? I didn't have an answer. I was traveling with $40 in my pocket, a deck of worn cards, and a borrowed Chevrolet that burned oil faster than gasoline. The car rattled when it idled and coughed every time I pushed it uphill, like it was reminding me that neither of us was built for comfort. I slept in the back seat more often than I slept in a bed, using my jacket as a blanket and my hat to block the morning sun. Some nights, the road felt like freedom. Other nights, it felt like exile. I wasn't running from the law. I wasn't chasing fame. I was running from something quieter, the life that waited for me if I stopped moving. A job behind a counter. A town where everyone knew your mistakes before you made them. A future already decided by people who never asked what you wanted. Poker gave me motion. Not just the physical kind. The miles, the towns, the changing scenery, but a sense that every night could end differently. That luck, skill, and nerve could bend reality just enough to make survival feel earned. At first, I played small games, kitchen tables, backrooms, places where the stakes were low and the lies were harmless. But even then, I noticed something most people miss. No 2 tables felt the same. Some rooms were tense the moment you walked in, like the air itself was waiting for someone to make a mistake. Other places felt loose, almost friendly, until you realized that friendliness was just another strategy. Poker, I learned, didn't change people, it revealed them. I watched men who couldn't afford to lose play like they had nothing left anyway. I watched others fold winning hands just to keep their pride intact. I watched friendships fracture over small pots and strangers bond over shared losses. And I watched myself change. The road has a way of stripping you down. When you live out of a car, you stop pretending quickly. There's no room for lies when every possession you own can be counted on your fingers. You learn what matters. You learn what doesn't. Money mattered, but not the way I expected. It wasn't about being rich. It was about being able to leave when you needed to. Gas money, food money, enough left over to buy into the next game. Enough to keep the road open. That's when they started calling me 2 aces. Not because I won big, not because I played flashy. Because I survived. I never showed everything I had. I never pushed unless I could afford the fall. I always held something back. A chip, a read, a plan for the exit. 2 aces wasn't about strength. It was about insurance. Most players didn't understand that. They chased the rush, the big pot, the moment when everyone at the table looked at them like they mattered. I chased tomorrow. I chased the next town, the next game that hadn't learned my face yet. Some nights, I'd sit alone in a diner at 3 in the morning, coffee going cold in front of me, listening to the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of trucks passing by. I'd replay hands in my head, not just the cards, but the people. The way a man's voice changed when he lied. The way someone avoided eye contact when they were strong. The way fear had its own rhythm. That was my real education. No school teaches you how to read desperation. No book explains how pride makes people reckless. You learn those things by sitting across from them, watching them bet pieces of themselves. They don't know how to lose. The road taught me patience. Hours would pass without a game. Towns would disappoint me. Doors would close. I learned to wait, to listen, to accept that sometimes the smartest move was not playing at all. But patience has a dark side. The longer you travel, the easier it becomes to justify things you once swore you'd never do. When you're hungry, tired, and far from anyone who knows your name, morality starts to feel flexible. The lines blur, right and wrong turn into winning and losing. I told myself I'd never cheat. I told myself I'd never hurt anyone. I told myself I'd walk away before it got ugly. Those promises felt solid back then, strong, unbreakable. They wouldn't stay that way. Each town tested me differently. Some offered easy money, others offered lessons. A few offered trouble that lingered longer than I wanted, and every time I thought I had the road figured out, it reminded me how small I really was. Still, I kept going. Because out there, between towns and timelines, I felt alive in a way I never had before. Every night carried possibility. Every table was a story waiting to be told. Every hand was a choice. Not just about cards, but about who I was becoming. And that's the part most people don't understand about poker on the road. It's not about the wins. It's about the moments between them. The drive after a loss. The silence after a close call. The way your reflection looks different in a motel mirror at dawn than it did the night before. By the time I reached Oklahoma City, I had learned how to read a room before I entered it. I had learned which games were safe, which were traps, and which were worse than both. I had learned when to speak and when to stay invisible. What I hadn't learned was how far I was willing to go when survival demanded more than patience. Because the next game wasn't just another stop on the road. It was the first time I crossed a line I couldn't uncross. The first time I won in a way that felt wrong and right at the same time. And the moment I realized that the road was no longer just carrying me forward, it was shaping me into someone I wasn't sure I recognized anymore. That's where the real story begins. The game was behind the bar. 5 men. No names. Just hands. The door didn't have a sign, no lock either, just a narrow frame stained darker where thousands of shoulders had brushed past it before mine. When I pushed it open, the noise from the bar faded instantly, like someone had shut the world off. What replaced it wasn't silence, it was concentration, thick, heavy, and patient. The room was small, too small for 5 men, and the kind of money that changes how people breathe. A single bulb hung over the table, buzzing softly, casting shadows that stretched longer than they should have. Smoke hovered low, trapped under the ceiling like it had nowhere else to go. No one greeted me. They didn't have to. I took a seat against the wall instead of the table and watched. That was my first smart decision of the night, and maybe the last one for a while. I watched them play for nearly 2 hours before I ever touched a chip. At first, it all looked the same. Cards moved, chips stacked and disappeared, hands reached out and pulled back. But if you stared long enough, patterns emerged. Not in the cards, in the men. One man blinked when he lied. Not every time, just enough to matter. His eyes stayed steady through small bets, through junk hands and casual raises. But when the pot grew heavy, when something real was on the line, he blinked twice. Quick, almost polite. Another man tapped his fingers when he was weak. 3 taps on the table, always the same rhythm. He didn't seem to notice he was doing it, which made it honest. Honest habits are dangerous. They feel safe until someone uses them against you. The 3rd man scared me. He didn't move at all. No tells, no rhythm, no reaction. He sat like a photograph, perfectly still as forward, breathing shallow. I couldn't tell if he was disciplined or empty. Sometimes those two look exactly the same. The 4th man smiled too much. Not happy smiles, tight ones, defensive. The kind people use when they want you to think they're comfortable. He laughed when he lost and laughed louder when he won. I made a note of that. Laughter, I'd learned, is often a shield. The fifth man, the one who would eventually ruin my night, barely looked at the cards. He watched people. That should have stopped me from ever sitting down. But youth has a way of mistaking observation for control. I told myself I understood what I was seeing. I told myself that watching was the same as knowing, that when the time came, I'd be ready. I wasn't. When I finally stood and walked to the table, no one objected. A chair was pulled back without a word. A stack of chips slid toward me, paid for with money that suddenly felt much heavier than it had in my pocket. I sat down and felt every eye measure me. Not curiosity. Assessment. The first few hands passed without incident. I folded early, letting myself fade into the background. The table accepted me the way predators accept a new shape in the distance, with interest, but no urgency. I listened to the sound of chips, watched the way hands hesitated, memorized the order of movements like a song I'd heard before, but never learned the lyrics to. I told myself I was calm. But my body disagreed. My pulse beat louder than the room. My fingers felt clumsy. Every time I reached for my chips, I was aware of the motion, like I was performing instead of acting naturally. Fear does that. It turns simple actions into rehearsed ones. Still, things were going well. Too well. That's how traps usually feel when you first step into them. Then the cards came. 2 aces. Black and red. Perfect. I remember thinking how clean they looked against the felt. How unreal it felt to be holding the best hand in the deck in a room that didn't forgive mistakes. My confidence returned all at once, flooding in where caution had been. I raised. The blinking man folded. The finger tapper hesitated, then folded too. The man who smiled, laughed, and called. And the quiet one across from me stayed in without changing his expression. That should have scared me. Instead, it thrilled me. The flop came down slow, harmless at first glance. No obvious danger. My hand was still strong, still in control. I told myself this was the moment I'd been waiting for, the moment when observation turned into execution. The bets climbed. Chips slid across the table like small, deliberate decisions. The smiling men dropped out. Just the two of us now, me and the one who watched people instead of cards. He looked at me for the first time. Not aggressively, not challengingly. Curiously. As if he were meeting me for the first time, not as a stranger, but as a problem. The turn card hit the felt. My stomach tightened. Still good, still ahead, probably. I pushed my chips forward. All of them. It felt bold, final, clean. The kind of move you make when you want the story to end with you standing. The man across from me didn't rush. He didn't react. He didn't even look at the cards right away. He studied my face, my hands, the way I was sitting in the chair. Then he called. The river card landed with a sound I still hear in my sleep. Soft, unassuming, devastating. I knew before he turned his hand over. That's the cruelest part of poker, the moment when certainty arrives before confirmation, when your body understands the truth seconds before your mind is willing to accept it. He revealed his card slowly. Not to show off. To teach. The table went quiet. No laughter, no commentary, no sympathy. Just the sound of my breathing getting shallow. I stared at the cards, waiting for something to change, for a mistake, for a rule I didn't know, for the universe to reconsider. It didn't. I had lost. Not just the hand. The room. I felt my face heat up, shame and disbelief tangling together. I reached forward without thinking, my hand still hovering over the felt where my chips used to be. That's when the bottle came down. Hard. Close enough to feel the impact through the table. Don't touch what's not yours, someone said. Not loud. Not angry. Certain. I pulled my hand back and saw the blood, then thin, bright, unreal against my skin. No one moved. No one apologized. The game resumed almost immediately, as if nothing important had happened. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady, my pride worse off than my hand. As I walked out of the room, I realized something that settled deep in my chest and stayed there. No one had cheated me. No one had broken the rules. I had lost because I believed watching was the same as understanding. Because I thought preparation meant immunity. Because I thought I was ready. I wasn't. Outside, the night air felt cold and sharp. I wrapped my hand in my sleeve and leaned against the wall, listening to the muffled sound of chips and voices behind me. The game went on without me, indifferent to my education. That should have been the end. But instead, it was the beginning. Because that night didn't just teach me how to lose. It taught me what the game was really asking for. And the next time I sat at a table, I wouldn't just be watching anymore. I lost everything in one hand. 2 aces, pocket rockets. And I still lost. The cards lay there on the table like evidence, undeniable and indifferent. Black ink on worn white paper, nothing dramatic about them anymore. No magic, no promise, just proof of a mistake I couldn't take back. No one spoke. That silence was worse than laughter, worse than anger. It stretched long enough for my thoughts to catch up with reality, long enough for my chest to tighten and my mouth to go dry. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and uneven, like I'd been running, even though I hadn't moved at all. The man across from me smiled. Not a wide smile, not a cruel one. A relieved one. As if something heavy had finally been set down, as if he'd been holding his breath the entire hand, and only now felt safe enough to exhale. That expression stayed with me longer than the loss itself. It told me everything I needed to know. He hadn't been afraid of the cards. He'd been afraid of me, or rather, of what I might do if I understood what was really happening. That's when it hit me. Winning wasn't the goal. Surviving was. Up until that moment, I'd thought poker was about proving something. Proving you were smarter, braver, better prepared. I believed the right hand, played the right way, would protect you. But sitting there, staring at 2 aces that had betrayed me, I understood how naive that belief was. The game didn't care about fairness. The table didn't care about potential. And the men around it didn't care about my future. They cared about one thing, whether I was dangerous or disposable. And right then, I was disposable. My ears rang as I pushed my chair back. The sound scraped against the floor louder than it should have, cutting through the quiet like a confession. I felt every eye track the movement, not with interest, but with evaluation. The way people look at something they've already decided isn't worth keeping. I stood too fast. That was my second mistake. The room tilted slightly, just enough to remind me how thin the line was between confidence and collapse. I reached forward instinctively, my hand hovering over the felt where my chips had been moments ago. That's when the bottle came down. Not thrown. Placed. Hard. The crack of glass against wood echoed in my bones. The vibration traveled up the table and into my arm before the pain even arrived. I froze, my fingers still half curled, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. "Don't," a voice said calmly. "Touch." I looked down. Blood welled up between my knuckles, bright and sudden, running in thin lines that felt unreal against my skin. It didn't hurt the way I expected. It burned. Yes, but more than that, it embarrassed me. No one rushed to help. No one apologized. The game resumed. Cards were shuffled, chips were stacked, life went on without me. That was the humiliation. Not the loss of money. Not the blood. But the realization that I had already ceased to matter. I wrapped my injured hand in my sleeve and backed away from the table. No one stopped me. No one watched me leave. I wasn't a threat anymore. I was a lesson that had already been learned. As I stepped out of the back room, the noise from the bar rushed back in. Laughter, music, the clink of glasses. It felt obscene, like the world had chosen the wrong moment to pretend everything was fine. I walked outside into the night and leaned against the brick wall, letting the cool air hit my face. My legs trembled now that the adrenaline was fading. I slid down until I was sitting on the ground, my back pressed against the building, my injured hand held awkwardly in my lap. I stared at it for a long time. Not because of the blood, but because it was proof. Proof that the game could reach out and mark you. Proof that mistakes didn't always end when the hand was over. Proof that some losses followed you outside. I could have driven away then. I thought about it. The car was still mine. The road was still open. There were towns ahead where no one knew my face. Places where this night would mean nothing. I could have decided that poker wasn't worth the cost. That survival meant quitting. That thought didn't last. Because beneath the shame, beneath the fear, something else had taken root. Understanding. I replayed the hand in my mind. Not the cards, but the moments, the pauses, the looks, the way the man across from me had studied me instead of the table. I realized that the hand hadn't been decided by luck or odds. It had been decided long before the cards were dealt. I had been sized up, measured, found wanting. That realization hurt more than the bottle ever could. I had walked into that room thinking preparation made me equal, thinking observation made me safe. But poker on the road wasn't about equality. It was about hierarchy, about knowing where you stood and whether you could change it. I hadn't just lost money. I'd lost position. And position, I was beginning to learn, was everything. Eventually, stood and walked back to my car. Each step felt heavier than the last. I opened the door and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. The dashboard clock glowed faintly, the only light inside the car. It told me the night was still young. Too young to end. I pressed my injured hand against the steering wheel and winced. The pain grounded me, reminded me I was still here, still breathing, still capable of making decisions, even bad ones. That's when I made a promise. Not out loud, not dramatically, just a quiet understanding with myself. I would never lose like that again. Not because of the cards, but because I misunderstood the room. I wouldn't confuse a strong hand with a strong position ever again. I wouldn't assume the game ended when the cards were turned over. And I wouldn't sit at another table until I understood what everyone else there was really playing for. That night didn't break me. It stripped me. Stripped away the idea that poker was fair. Stripped away the belief that talent alone was enough. Stripped away the comfort of thinking survival was automatic. As the engine finally turned over and the car pulled back onto the empty road, I glanced at my reflection in the windshield. I barely recognized the face staring back. Not because it looked older, because it looked awake. I didn't know it yet, but that humiliation, that quiet, bleeding moment outside a forgotten bar was the last time I would ever sit at a table as the most naive man in the room. The next game would be different. Because next time, I wouldn't just be playing the cards. I'd be playing for something much harder to win. And much harder to keep. That night, an old man followed me outside. I didn't notice him at first. I was too busy trying to keep my breathing steady, too busy pretending my hand didn't hurt as much as it did, too busy replaying the loss over and over in my head like a bad tune that wouldn't leave. The bar door closed behind me with a dull thud, and the noise inside vanished, replaced by the open, empty sound of the road. That's when I heard footsteps. Slow. Uneven. Not threatening, not careful either, just steady enough to belong to someone who had nowhere else to be. I turned halfway, ready to defend myself if I had to. Instead, I saw him. He was old in the way men get old when they've spent their lives outdoors and indoors in equal measure. His back was slightly bent, his coat too thin for the night air, his hat pulled low more out of habit than style. His face was lined deeply, not with anger, but with time. The kind of face that had seen patterns repeat themselves often enough to stop being surprised. He stopped a few feet away and looked at my hand. Not the blood. The way I was holding it. "That your first lesson?" he asked. His voice was calm, not sympathetic, not mocking. Curious. I didn't answer. I wasn't sure what the right response was. I didn't even know what the question really meant yet. He nodded anyway, as if my silence confirmed something. I could hear it from inside, he said. Sound of a bottle on wood. Table makes a different noise when it's angry. I almost laughed at that. Almost. Instead, I leaned against the wall and slid down until I was sitting again. My legs didn't argue this time. They were tired of pretending I was still in control. The old man joined me slowly, lowering himself onto an overturned crate nearby. He didn't rush, didn't glance back toward the door, didn't act like he was afraid someone might notice him missing. That told me something. Don't worry, he said, lighting a cigarette with hands that shook just enough to show their age. They won't come out. You already paid. That stung more than I expected. He took a long drag and let the smoke drift upward, watching it disappear into the dark. 2 aces, he said casually. That's what did it, right? I froze. I hadn't told anyone. I hadn't even said it out loud to myself yet. He saw my reaction and smiled faintly. Always is, he continued. Best hand in the deck. Worst teacher. I stared at him now, really looked at him, trying to decide whether he was dangerous, whether this was another part of the game. I didn't understand yet. He noticed my caution and shook his head. Relax, kid. I'm not here for your money. He paused. I'm here because I recognize that look. He tapped his temple with a finger. That look that says you're trying to figure out whether you're bad at this, or whether the world just lied to you. That was exactly it. I hadn't known how to name it until he did. I asked him who he was. He smiled again, this time more genuinely. No one you'd recognize, he said. Which is the point? We sat there in silence for a moment, listening to the wind move across the empty lot. Somewhere in the distance, a truck passed, its headlights sweeping briefly across the wall like a memory that didn't linger. Then he spoke again. Let me ask you something, he said. When you pushed all your chips in, what did you think would happen? I hesitated. I thought he'd fold, I said finally. Why? Because I had the best hand. He chuckled softly at that, not unkindly, like someone hearing a familiar story told badly. And did he know that? No. Then what exactly were you betting on? I opened my mouth to answer and realized I didn't have one. The old man nodded, satisfied. That's the mistake, he said. You weren't playing the game. You were playing the idea of the game. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Poker isn't about what you have, he continued. It's about what they think you have, and more importantly, what they think you think they have. My head hurt, but not in a bad way. In the way it does when something shifts. I watched that table tonight, he said. Watched you, too. You're not stupid. You saw the tells. You noticed the habits, but you were looking in the wrong place. Where should I have been looking? I asked. He pointed at his chest. Here, he said, and here. Then he tapped his eyes. You were studying fingers and blinks. You should have been studying fear, comfort, desperation. Those don't live in hands. They live in posture, in breath, in timing. He took another drag from his cigarette. The man who beat you, he said, he didn't win because of the river card. He won because he knew you wanted the hand to end. That sentence settled heavily between us. He knew you wanted it over, the old man continued. Knew you were tired of waiting. Knew you were ready to prove something. So he let you. I thought back to the moment, the all-in shove, the surge of confidence, the need to finish it. He was right. That's why I smiled when he called, the old man said quietly, because I knew what you hadn't learned yet. I looked at my hand again, flexed my fingers carefully. So what's the lesson? I asked. Never go all in? He shook his head. No, the lesson is to know why you're doing it. He stubbed out the cigarette and stood slowly, stretching his back. Kid, he said, looking down at me now, if you play the cards, you'll starve. He let that sit. If you play the man, you might live long enough to regret it. That line hit harder than anything else that night. Because it wasn't a promise. It was a warning. He adjusted his coat and started to walk away, then stopped, as if reconsidering something. "One more thing," he said over his shoulder. "Next time you sit down, don't ask yourself what hand you want." I waited. "Ask yourself what story you're telling," he finished, "and whether it makes sense for the man across from you to believe it." Then he was gone. I didn't see where he went. One moment he was there, the next he blended into the darkness like he'd never existed at all. I stayed there for a long time after that. Long enough for the pain in my hand to dull, long enough for the night to feel quieter, long enough for the loss to stop screaming and start explaining itself. I realized something important then. The game hadn't humiliated me for no reason. It had introduced me to a rule I didn't know existed. That poker on the road wasn't about winning money, not at first. It was about learning how men think when no one is watching, about understanding what people protect, and what they're willing to risk when they believe they're unseen. I started the engine and pulled back onto the highway with a different kind of focus than before. The road stretched ahead of me, empty and patient, just like the tables would be in the towns to come. I wasn't ready yet, but I was closer. And the next time I played, I wouldn't just be holding cards. I'd be holding a mirror. I slept in the car that night. Not because I wanted to, because I had nowhere else to go. The Chevrolet was parked a block away from the bar, far enough that the noise couldn't reach me, close enough that the shame still could. I reclined the seat as far as it would go, which wasn't far at all, and stared at the cracked ceiling liner above my head. It sagged in the middle, like it had given up trying to look decent a long time ago. Hungry. Ashamed. Those were the two things that kept me awake. My stomach growled softly, the sound embarrassingly loud in the quiet car. I hadn't eaten since morning, $40 ago. Before I believed the night would end differently. Hunger wasn't new to me, but tonight it felt personal, like another reminder that I'd misjudged my place in the world. My hand throbbed dully, wrapped in a strip torn from my shirt. Every pulse carried the memory of that bottle hitting the table, the casual certainty behind it. Not anger, not rage. Control. That was the part that stayed with me. I turned onto my side and curled up slightly, trying to find a position that didn't hurt. The smell of old upholstery, oil, and cigarette smoke clung to everything. My jacket was thin. The night air crept in through the door seams, cold and persistent, like regret finding its way back in. I closed my eyes, and the cards came back immediately. 2 aces. Perfect. Useless. I saw them again on the felt, saw the man across from me, saw that smile. Not happy, not cruel, just relieved. The expression of someone who had escaped something worse than losing money. That smile hurt more than the loss. Because it told me the truth. I hadn't been beaten. I'd been handled. I sat up abruptly, breath catching in my chest. My reflection stared back at me from the dark windshield. Pale, tired, younger than I felt, older than I wanted to be. I barely recognized myself, not because of what I'd lost, but because of what I'd learned. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the deck of cards. They were worn thin at the edges, softened by years of shuffling. The faces were faded, the back scratched and uneven. They weren't special. They weren't lucky. They were honest. I began to shuffle. Slow at first, clumsy with my injured hand. The cards slapped together unevenly, falling into my lap once, twice. I cursed under my breath and started again. Overhand shuffle, riffle, bridge. The familiar motions calmed something inside me. I shuffled not to play, but to remember. Each shuffle brought back a piece of the night, the room, the light, the way the air felt thick before the all-in, the way my heart had raced when I thought I had control. Control. That word tasted bitter. Now, poker, I realized, wasn't about being in control. It was about knowing when you weren't. The hours passed slowly. The street outside stayed quiet. Occasionally, a car passed, headlights sweeping briefly across the interior, then disappearing again. Time felt suspended, like the world was holding its breath with me. I shuffled until my fingers ached, until the hunger faded into the background, until the shame softened into something else. Resolve. I thought about quitting. Not seriously, but honestly. There was a version of my life where this was the end of the story, where I drove back home, found a job, told myself the road was a phase, where I remembered poker as something I tried once and failed at. That version of me felt smaller, not weaker, smaller. And I realized something important then. I didn't mind losing. What I couldn't accept was not understanding why. That's what kept me in the car. That's what kept the cards moving through my hands. I wasn't angry at the men in that room. They had played their game. I was angry at myself for thinking the game ended at the cards, for believing strength came from what I held instead of what I projected. The old man's words came back to me and invited but welcome. If you play the cards, you'll starve. If you play the man, you might live long enough to regret it. I finally understood what he meant. Playing the man wasn't about manipulation. It was about awareness. It was about knowing that every player brought more than chips to the table. They brought fear, pride, desperation, history, and that those things mattered more than odds ever could. I leaned back and stared at the dark sky through the windshield. Clouds moved slowly overhead, barely visible, like thoughts drifting past without urgency. Somewhere, far off, a train horn sounded, low and lonely. I felt very small, but I didn't feel lost. That was new. As the night deepened, something else happened. The shame stopped shouting. It didn't disappear, it settled, became quieter, more useful. Shame, I realized, could either break you or sharpen you. I thought about the man who beat me, how calm he'd been, how patient, how he'd let me walk myself into the trap without ever pushing. I replayed his movements, his timing, the way he'd waited for me to commit. He hadn't outplayed my hand. He'd outweighted my ego. That thought stuck. By the time the sky began to lighten slightly at the edges, my eyes burned from lack of sleep, my back ached, my stomach hurt again, but something inside me felt steadier than it had in months. I shuffled one last time and set the deck on the passenger seat. Then I made myself a promise. Not the kind you say out loud. Not the kind you tell other people about. The kind you make quietly, because you know breaking it would cost more than keeping it ever could. I promised myself I would never lose the same way twice. Not that I'd never lose again. Loss was inevitable. But ignorance wasn't. I promised I would listen longer than I spoke, watch longer than I played, wait until the table told me what it was really about. I promised myself that next time, I wouldn't be so eager to end the hand. I would be willing to let it breathe. The sun finally crept over the horizon, pale and tired, painting the road in weak shades of gray. Morning always feels honest. It doesn't flatter, it doesn't hide much, it just shows you where you are. I started the car. The engine hesitated, coughed, then caught. I smiled faintly at the sound. It felt appropriate. Neither of us worked perfectly, but we were still moving. As I pulled onto the empty road, the town slipped behind me without ceremony. No closure, no apology, just distance. Ahead, somewhere down the line, there would be another table, another room, another group of men who believed they understood the game. And this time, I wouldn't be the youngest man at the table anymore. Not really. Because I was done playing to prove something. Next time, I'd be playing to survive. And survival, I was beginning to learn, required more than good cards. It required patience, memory, and the willingness to sit in the dark long enough to understand it. That night in the car didn't make me a winner, but it made me dangerous in a way I hadn't been before. And the road was just getting started. 2 weeks later, in Oklahoma City, I cheated for the first time. And I won. I didn't plan it the way people imagine cheating is planned. There was no grand scheme. No dramatic moment where I told myself I was crossing a line forever. It happened quietly, almost politely, the way most irreversible decisions do. The game was in the back of a pool hall off a street that smelled like rain and oil. The felt was newer than the last table I'd seen, but the men weren't. Same eyes, same weight behind every movement. I recognized the rhythm immediately. This time, I didn't rush. I watched. Not hands. Not chips. Men. I watched who leaned forward when they felt powerful, who slouched when they felt safe, who avoided eye contact only after the pot grew too large to lose comfortably. I listened to breathing, to timing, to the spaces between words. And slowly, something clicked. The old man's voice echoed in my head like a rule I hadn't known existed before. Play the man. So when the moment came, when the cards aligned just enough, when the tension hung heavy enough in the air, did something small. Something almost invisible. A card slid a fraction of an inch closer, a fingertip lingered half a second too long, a movement that looked like nervousness, but wasn't. No one said a word. The hand ended, and the chips came my way. My heart didn't race. That's what scared me most. I felt calm, efficient, like I had simply corrected something unfair. I left that table with money in my pocket and a hollow feeling in my chest. The night air felt different this time. Heavier, quieter, less forgiving. I drove until the city lights disappeared behind me, pulled over, and sat in the dark with the engine off. I waited for guilt. It didn't come. Instead, something else settled in. Awareness. I told myself I had done what I needed to survive, that the men at that table would have done worse if given the chance, that this was just how the game worked beyond a certain point. And maybe that was true. But here's what no one tells you about winning that way. The money feels colder. It doesn't warm you. It doesn't celebrate with you. It just sits there, watching. I didn't spend that money right away. I kept it folded in my wallet like evidence, pulling it out sometimes just to prove it was real. Every time I touched it, I felt the weight of that moment, not pride, not shame, but consequence. Because cheating changes something. Not the world. You. After Oklahoma City, the road didn't feel the same anymore. Every game carried a question now, one I hadn't asked myself before. How far am I willing to go tonight? That question followed me from town to town, from table to table. Some nights I played clean, some nights I didn't, and each time I crossed that line again, it became easier, not because I felt better about it, but because I understood the cost. The truth is, poker on the road doesn't reward innocence. It tolerates it, briefly. Then it eats it alive. I started winning more often after that. Not big wins, not flashy ones, just enough. Enough to keep moving, enough to stay fed, enough to believe I was learning how the world actually worked. But every win leaves ripples. And not all of them fade. I didn't know it then, but someone at that table in Oklahoma City had been watching me the same way I'd been watching everyone else. Someone who didn't care about the cards. Someone who cared about patterns. Someone who noticed my face. Weeks passed, then months. I crossed state lines like they meant nothing. Played games in basements, motels, private homes, and places I can't describe without leaving something out. I learned when to disappear, when to linger, when to fold a winning hand just to survive another night. But no matter how far I drove, that win stayed with me. Because the road has a memory. And poker has a longer one. Every time I sat at a new table, I wondered if tonight would be the night someone recognized me. Not by name, not by reputation, by instinct. Because men who live in that world develop a sense for danger the way animals do. They remember faces that don't belong, eyes that look just a little too alert, movements that are too careful. I started to realize something terrifying. Winning wasn't protection. It was exposure. The more I survived, the more visible I became. And the longer I stayed on the road, the fewer mistakes I could afford. Looking back now, I understand why that first win followed me for years. It wasn't because of the money. It was because of the choice. That night in Oklahoma City was the moment I stopped pretending I was just passing through the game. It was the moment I accepted that poker wasn't something happening to me. It was something I was becoming part of. And the game always collects. Sometimes it takes money, sometimes blood, sometimes sleep, sometimes names. But it always remembers. There's a reason I'm telling you this now. Not to justify what I did, not to glorify it, and certainly not to warn you away from poker. But to tell you the truth, most stories leave out. Every road story has a moment where the character changes direction, not physically, but morally. A moment where survival demands a decision that can't be undone. That was mine. And the consequences didn't arrive right away. They never do. They waited. They watched. And when they finally came, they came wearing a familiar face. That story starts in episode 2. Now, I want to hear from you. Be honest. What would you have done in that situation? Would you have cheated to survive, or walked away hungry and clean? And tell me, what city are you watching this from right now? I read every comment, and I want to know where this road reaches. If this story pulled you in, if you felt the tension, the hunger, the quiet moments between decisions, hit the like button. It tells YouTube this story deserves to keep traveling. Subscribe to the channel if you want to continue this journey with me. Because the road doesn't end here. And neither does the game. Episode 2 is waiting.